Hello all! Congratulations on reaching the end of the Roman era of Jewish history, a series which was much longer than even I anticipated, and by much longer I mean a full episode more than I planned to make, for which I can thank Simon Sebag Montefiore's fascinating book, Jerusalem the Biography. Anyway, before going ahead, I want to say thank you to everyone who found my channel most recently through Reddit and put out some admin alerts. First, there isn't going to be a second Jewish history video for September because, dear God, I need a break. I'm moving to a new apartment, and I've spent so much time making these videos lately that I've forgotten how to do anything else. Of course, by the time you see this, my break will be over, and I will be working on October's videos, about which you should expect a few collabs with some other great channels that I'm really happy to be working with. Going forward into the medieval era, there is going to be a major style change. Up to this point, I have been using English names for Jewish historical figures, as that's the style used in the Bible, but from here on, I will be using the native form. One of the questions brought up in the comments was over where the name Ashkenaz comes from. Was it a word of Germanic origin related to Sax? It's not, but the question led me down a really interesting rabbit hole that I'm happy to share with all of you. The name Ashkenaz first appears in a part of the book of Genesis called the Table of Nations. You would probably recognize this as the Begats. This was a kind of folk genealogy meant to explain the origins of every people group in the known world to the Jews in the very early Second Temple period. It generalizes a lot and categorizes groups of people in ways that wouldn't really occur to us today, and the further one got from West Asia, the more dubious the understanding was of who lived out there. Which goes a long way towards saying that Ashkenaz was the avowed biblical ancestor of, and the catch-all term for, all peoples living in Transalpine Europe, from Gaul to the Caspian Sea. So Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, Iranian peoples living there would have all been considered part of this concept of Ashkenaz. However, after the destruction of the temple, in a process that took many centuries, because there were suddenly very large Jewish populations in these very far-flung places, the linguistic convention began to shift to a style whereby the non-Hebrew names would apply to the countries and regions as a whole, and only the specific areas with very concentrated Jewish populations would keep the old Hebrew name. Now, sometimes this meant whole countries, which is why, to this day, France in Hebrew is Tzarfat, and Spain is Sfarad, but by the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the meaning of Ashkenaz had basically reduced in meaning to the area where Ashkenazi Jews lived, which is today the German state of Rhineland-Pfalz and the French region of Alsace-Lorraine. So when I decided to make a woman the image for a typical Jewish slave in the Roman Empire, I did so for two main purposes. First, because many more women survived captivity in Rome than men, for reasons I explained in the Masada video. And second, because I was just tired of talking about and showing nothing but men. However, in so doing, and this was brought to me by a viewer in person, I may have raised the implication that Ashkenazi Jews were primarily the product of sexual violence committed by Roman masters against enslaved Jewish women. This was not my intention, and that was not the case. Was there sexual violence against Jewish women by men of greater societal privilege? Were Jewish children conceived as a result? Absolutely. That had been happening, and it would continue to happen. But looking over the whole history, there seems not to have been any more interrelations, consensual or otherwise, between Jewish women and Gentile men in Ashkenaz than anywhere else. It also bears noting that the majority of Jews taken as slaves at the end of the war were teenagers, both boys and girls, and the Ashkenazi community, in both the genome and the legacy of certain names and titles like Levi or Cohen or Katz, is reflective of patrilineal as well as matrilineal descent. And if you're wondering why the slave woman is also the thumbnail image of this video, it's because that's actually me using the Face app, and I got tired of cycling through the same 4 poses for every recap video. This is not actually a question that anyone asked, but I bring it up because I've seen people ask it in the past. And on the same day that this video is coming out, the channel Useful Charts has released a video about the Hasmonean and Herodian dynasties as part of its biblical genealogy series, which just happens to have been written and narrated by me. Great channel. You should definitely check it out if you like all of my old family trees from earlier videos. In that video, which is coming out today, I conclude that any descendants of both the Herodian and the Hasmonean dynasties today likely descend from the marriage of Agrippa's daughter Mariamne to the Alabarch of Alexandria. However, what I forgot is that King Herod, in addition to the 7 sons I included in my graphics, also had another son, and more importantly, he had at least 5 daughters, including 2 by Mariamne the Hasmonean. Their elder daughter Salampsio, which is just an alternate translation of Salome, there were a lot of Salomes, she had 5 children, one of whom was the wife of Agrippa the Great, and the rest just kind of married into the mainstream Jewish nobility. What happened to the other daughters, who knows? Judea may have been a less patriarchal society than Rome, but it was still a very patriarchal society, as well as a quite elitist one, so what happened to them was not considered to be important, and thus wasn't written down. So, over such a long period of time, it's actually likely that most Jews today are descendants of the Herodians and Hasmoneans, in the same way that most Europeans are descendants of Charlemagne. So, the one question I got about the Kitos War, overlooked as always, is what the casualty numbers were. I take that to mean the fatalities of the war. And that is a tricky question that we don't really have a complete answer to. Cassius Dio claims that at least 460,000 Gentiles were killed in Cyprus and Cyrenaica combined, but he doesn't give fatalities for Egypt, Judea, or Mesopotamia. Meanwhile, the sociologist Bernard Beck contends that 200,000 Jews were killed in the war. An obstacle in corroborating these numbers, firstly, is that Cassius Dio was not alive when the war happened, and did not have a favorable opinion of the Jews generally, being very much in the same vein as Tacitus. Another obstacle is that the Kitos War overlaps with, and arguably was part of, Trajan's Parthian War, in the same way that the Second Sino-Japanese War started as its own thing and then became part of World War II. So it's hard to be certain whether Beck's figure includes some or all Jewish casualties from the Parthian War itself. Although nobody took the bait, I did kind of invite a question by mentioning that Rabbi Akiva was the chief rabbi of Bnei Brak. But if anyone was wondering, that is not the location of the modern city of Bnei Brak, which if you don't know, is a mostly ultra-Orthodox suburb of Tel Aviv. Modern Bnei Brak is a few kilometers north, and the old city is now the site of the former landfill known as the Hiria. Why they put the landfill there after Israel's independence, I have no idea. But if you've ever gotten off a plane at Ben Gurion and taken a train to Tel Aviv, that weird hill you pass is where Bnei Brak used to be. Anyway, the comments in this video were flooded with an entire genre of questions along the line of, why isn't the Bar Kokhba revolt better remembered? And if you're Jewish, this is very well remembered. But if you're not, it's probably pretty obscure because Hadrian is, in the mainstream of society, very positively remembered as one of the 5 good emperors. But considering that Hadrian was also hated by the Romans in his own time, particularly the Senate, a lot of people wanted to know why his reputation is so much better today, and for that we can mostly thank one man. Edward Gibbon was a British politician and historian who, between 1776 and 1789, published a 6-volume epic called The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is probably the single most influential modern text on the Roman Empire, period. He did not come up with the term 5 good emperors, Niccolò Machiavelli did, but Gibbon really popularized the idea in the English-speaking world at a time when Britain was becoming the world's biggest superpower and bringing its educational system to the far corners of the world. The reason Gibbon is more favorable to Hadrian is that he agreed with Hadrian. Gibbon himself absolutely believed, and he wrote in his work, that Jews were the enemies of Western civilization, and like a lot of bigots since, he couched his belief in a general dislike of religion. That's not to say that his atheism or deism, take your pick, was insincere. A huge amount of Gibbon's work theorizes that the Roman Empire created a lot of problems for itself by adopting Christianity as its official religion. And if you couldn't guess from the last video in this series, that's a position that I agree with. But he also used it very much as a shield to demonize Jews, in a way that went beyond any actual criticism of religion. He was kind of the Hitchens of his time. So the biggest mistake of this series, by far, Simon Bar Yochai was not executed. He was turned in by one of his students, Judah ben Gerim, and he was sentenced to death, but he evaded capture by hiding in a cave near Gadara, in what is now Jordan, with his son, for 13 years. Eventually, he received some kind of clemency, and he did die just short of Antoninus Pius himself, so that was my mistake. If you are someone who is exceptionally educated in Jewish theology, an omission from this episode that you may have noticed is that Simon Bar Yochai is traditionally credited as the author of the Zohar, which is the foundational text of Kabbalah. Emphasis on traditionally, he simply isn't. I will get to this in a future episode, but the Zohar was not published until over 1,000 years after Bar Yochai's death by a rabbi named Moses de Leon, who claimed to have discovered it. But critical scholars and linguists have concluded from analysis that the book was basically written in broken Aramaic, probably by a native speaker of Spanish, so do with that what you will. So there's an additional complication to the Hebrew calendar that I left out of the episode, and that is that the length of a year varies not just by the number of months, but also by the number of days. That is to say that, in addition to a leap month, a year in the Hebrew calendar might also be a day shorter or a day longer than usual. I left it out at the time because I barely understood it, and because I couldn't possibly have explained it in a way that the audience would have been able to follow. So the issue at play here is basically that each month has either 29 or 30 days, which almost averages out to the length of the lunar month. But only almost. Because, just like the solar year doesn't line up with the lunar month doesn't line up with the day. So a lunar month is actually 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 3 1/3 seconds. And to make up for the lost 44 minutes and 3 1/3 seconds, sometimes the month of Cheshvan will be a day longer, and sometimes the month of Kislev will be a day shorter, or both. The overall effect is that there are 6 different numbers of days that a Jewish year can have. And this is also part of the mechanism that keeps both Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, and Yom Kippur from falling on a Sunday or Friday. What's interesting about this, and this will come back in a future episode, is that the way that this is calculated is by whether the molad, I don't know the English for this, but whether the exact totality of the new moon occurs before or after noon. It's more complicated than that, but that's the basic concept. The problem with this method of calculation is that the calendar was primarily developed by rabbis from Mesopotamia, and they calculated the molad based on when it was noon in Babylon, not in Jerusalem. You might immediately see the problem with this because the Earth is round, and they knew that, they'd known that for a long time. But it gets worse because at this time, there were no mechanical clocks, and without any kind of automated timekeeping, it was impossible to calculate longitude. Except that it wasn't, because now we have this error in the molad, and if you can measure that error, you can reverse engineer longitude. Sooner rather than later, someone will do that. But that's for another time. I mentioned in this video that prior to the creation of the Hebrew calendar, the Sanhedrin had aspired to create an automated calendar like that developed by Julius Caesar. The irony of this is that the Hebrew calendar that they came up with is actually more accurate to the solar year than the Julian calendar. The Julian calendar drifted by 3 days every 400 years, which is why it was eventually replaced in the Renaissance with the Gregorian calendar, which is what most of the world uses today. However, the Hebrew calendar is less accurate than the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar only drifts like one day every 4,000 years, something like that. But the Hebrew calendar has already drifted by one day every 231 years. In theory, this means we've drifted by about a week. Although, because the Hebrew calendar uses leap months instead of leap days, this isn't a problem yet, and it won't be for many more centuries. However, whoever decides to fix the calendar in that way will not be able to just impose it. There will be opposition. Something that a lot of people who equate Judaism with Christianity, and I will have a lot to say about that when I cover the similarities between Judaism and Islam, something they don't understand is that Judaism is a non-dogmatic religion. So there's no infallible authority that can just impose a new calendar. It will just have to catch on, and that will take centuries. Indeed, that's why it took centuries for the original Hebrew calendar to be universally adopted. To a degree, the Hebrew calendar wasn't fully implemented until the 20th century. One of the things the last Sanhedrin introduced was Anno Mundi, the counting of years based on the biblical date of creation. Before 358, Jews still used the old Seleucid calendar, if you can believe it. That's what you find in the books of the Maccabees, and that's what you find in the writings of Josephus. And in fact, Yemenite Jews continued to use the Seleucid counting up to their flight to Israel in the 1950s. Of course, this all raises the question of how the Samaritan calendar works, because Samaritans and Jews are so similar. Well, obviously, the Samaritans have the same Torah, and in Exodus chapter 12 it says, "This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you," which is traditionally interpreted to mean that religious authorities have the responsibility to maintain the calendar. So the Samaritans, because they still have a temple and high priest, kept the calendar manual until the 1980s or 1990s. I couldn't get an exact date. That's when the high priest entrusted the calendar to a computer algorithm. And although that algorithm does use the same metonic system as Jews, the start point is off by a few years. So most of the time, not always, but most of the time, the Samaritan calendar will be off by about a month from the Jewish calendar. And finally, a question I got was, what happened to the menorah after it returned to Jerusalem? The short answer to that is that nobody knows. The entire reason that I put that segment about the menorah in the video is because it was too good of a story to pass up. If we knew what happened to it after it arrived in Jerusalem, it would have been in the video. When Procopius writes that the menorah returned to Jerusalem after being taken from Carthage, that is the last we ever hear of it in history. We can speculate. When construction halted on the Third Temple during the Final War, the Persians took most or all of the Christian relics in the city back to Ctesiphon to basically hold hostage until the end of the war. It's possible that the menorah went with them, but it isn't mentioned among the relics brought back by Heraclius at the war's end. So in all likelihood, the menorah is just lost. Now, in saying all of that, I may wrongly give the impression that this specific artifact is a necessary tool for rebuilding the temple. It isn't. You could make a new one, and it would be no less in accordance with Jewish law, though it would have significantly less sentimental value. And that's the Roman period. I'm really excited to be covering medieval Judaism next. I know I've already covered some stuff that's pretty obscure, even by the standards of Jewish education, but now we're going into a period of Jewish history that straight up is not talked about, except maybe in some university courses. On the one hand, a lot of it is very depressing, and I get that. On the other hand, we're reaching a point where Jewish history is less the story of kings and armies, and more the story of ideas and knowledge. And I haven't really gotten to talk about that thus far, and I'm working very hard to make it fun. Special thanks to my patrons, Lev Cham, Vicky Nelson, and Or Weiss. You can become a patron on Patreon. It's linked in the description. Chag Sameach, Happy New Year, and I'll see you in October.